we explored music from the end of the 18th century. But today I'm heading back to the beginning of the century to explore the life of the composer and oboist Giuseppe Sammartini. Now, Sammartini is one of my favourite composers, and we often perform his music in my period group Ensemble Hespery. In fact, we've just come out of finishing a recording in Oxford, and on that CD, which will be released in November, there will be a fantastic Sammartini trio sonata in D minor. So watch this space. Like Francesco Gimignani, Sammartini has kind of fallen into relative obscurity, despite being held in really high esteem during his lifetime, and for some decades afterwards. Perhaps one of the reasons Sammartini has undeservedly become rather obscure is that he had the misfortune to have a brother who had the same initials as him, Giovanni Battista Sammartini, and he of course is Giuseppe. So it becomes rather confusing when you're trying to decide which works belong to which composer, if only the initials G. Sammartini have been written down. But apart from that, both brothers were born in Milan, where they performed as oboists, and Giovanni actually remained in Milan for the rest of his working life. However, Giuseppe, who was the older of the two brothers, also seems to have been the better player, and he started to become rather well known beyond Italy. For example, when the famous flute player and composer Quantz visited Milan in around 1726, he actually considered Sammartini to be the only good wind player in the opera orchestra, which perhaps says something about the standards of the opera orchestras in Milan at the time. In any case, Giuseppe realised that his talent might be better remunerated elsewhere, and of course London in the 1720s was really becoming the place where you could earn money as a professional musician. And so he decided in around 1728-29 to go to London and to settle there, which he did for the rest of his life. So he was really jumping on a trend, really. As soon as he was sort of arrived in London, he started to seek out lucrative performances, mainly on the oboe, which he was particularly famed for. Sammartini's real skill on the oboe can't be underestimated. Those of you who play the Baroque oboe know how difficult it is to produce a really beautiful sound on it compared to the modern oboe. But Sammartini apparently absolutely could. And his technique was so much talked about in London, where he lived and worked. And in fact, when he died in around 1750, he was described in a kind of little obituary in the Whitehall Evening Post as the finest performer on the hautboy or oboe in Europe. The music historian John Hawkins, writing later in the 18th century, gives a rather detailed description of Sammartini's playing and his transformation of the oboe scene in England. He writes, "As a performer on the hautboy, Martini was undoubtedly the greatest that the world had ever known. Before his time, the tone of the instrument was rank, and in the hands even of the ablest proficient, harsh and grating to the ear. By great study and application, and by some peculiar management of the reed, he contrived to produce such a tone as approached the nearest to that of the human voice of any we know of." And Sammartini is actually constantly mentioned in advertisements for performances in London from 1729 onwards. And we know that he played not only in smaller concerts, for example the famous castle concerts, but also in opera orchestras, where he was singled out for praise sometimes in reviews. Many of the most difficult obbligato parts in Handel's oratorios were probably written for Sammartini, as his name appears on the autograph scores on several different occasions. So we can see really that Sammartini had a very, very successful performing career. But of course, like today, oboe players also doubled as recorder players in orchestras, and Sammartini would have also played the recorder to a high standard. And we kind of know that he was particularly fond of the recorder as well, because he composed huge numbers of sonatas, which I believe many of which are for the recorder particularly. And this is one of the reasons that he's quite known to recorder players in particular. It's often quite clear that when you play these sonatas that they're probably written for the recorder. They have the exact range, they don't go below bottom F, and they feel very comfortable under the fingers. So I like to think that some of them at least have the recorder in mind. If you heard any of the bite-sized Baroque concerts that Tom and I gave over this the second lockdown, from Christmas onwards, I think we performed a couple of them, and they really are quite extraordinary sonatas with really unusual elements for the Baroque period. I'm looking forward to the classical period with a lot of the ornamentation. Of course, a lot of you know as well his fantastic F major concerto for a soprano recorder and orchestra, and it's a staple of the grade 8 Descartes recorder syllabus. So a lot of my students have played it. It's a fantastic concerto which I've performed myself several times, and it's actually interesting because it's one of the few concertos written for the soprano recorder as opposed to the alto or the sopranino concerto recorders, which of course Vivaldi mainly composed for. So kind of interesting from that point of view. Like all 18th century musicians, Sammartini also taught on his instrument, and he had many English oboe students, many of whom went on to have very successful performance careers in the succeeding generations. In the 1730s, he was actually employed by the heir to the throne, Frederick, Prince of Wales, and his wife, Augusta. He became music master to Augusta and to his children, to Frederick's children, a position he held from 1736 until his death in around 1750. This was a very significant appointment. It was very long-lasting, and at the time music masters often became really a member of the family in the royal household if they were employed for significant periods. We can tell this by the fact that Sammartini dedicated some of his music to Frederick and Augusta. His Opus 1 sonatas were dedicated to Frederick, and his Opus 3 trios to Augusta. He also composed an overture to a ballet for the birthday of Frederick's daughter, Lady Augusta, and really showing that, as John Hawkins, the music historian, said, Frederick was his great patron. Through Frederick, Prince of Wales, Sammartini appears to have had an acquaintance, or a friendship even, with our favourite Scottish Baroque composer James Oswalt. Oswalt seems to have been associated with Frederick's household as well. Probably as a music master like Sammartini, and he dedicated his curious collection of Scots tunes in the early 1740s to Frederick, Prince of Wales as well. So the two men must have moved in similar circles, and in fact it was Oswalt who published Sammartini's 6 sonatas or duets in around 1747, shortly before Sammartini's death. The sonatas were actually published under a name, the Society of the Temple of Apollo. Many people have assumed that the society was a kind of membership society, and that Sammartini was therefore a member of a slightly mysterious secret musical society which James Oswalt ran. Unfortunately, the truth is probably a little bit more mundane, in that this Temple of Apollo was a brand name for James Oswalt, and he would invite lots of different composers to compose for the society. He was very lucky, in fact, that Sammartini agreed to compose for him. So what was his music like? Well, although Giuseppe Sammartini didn't compose as much as his younger brother, Giovanni, he still left us a great deal of music to enjoy. His printed collections include 24 sonatas for flute and bass, or indeed solo wind instrument and bass, 30 trios for flutes, violins, 24 concerti grossi, 4 keyboard concertos, which we're really looking forward to exploring soon, and an oboe concerto, many overtures, and duets, cello sonatas. So really a wide range of instrumental music. John Hawkins, the music historian, believed that he may, without injury, be classed with Corelli and Gimignani, and that he had a fertile invention, gave into a style of modulation less restrained by rule than that of his predecessors, and by consequence affording greater scope for his fancy. Hawkins kind of acknowledges that sometimes Sammartini pushed harmonic boundaries and this wasn't always very popular, but this was a result, in his opinion, of his boldness and self-possession, which were the result of his particular genius. Charles Burney actually described Sammartini's music as full of science, originality and fire. And according to a contemporary, Sammartini's attitude to his compositions was indeed rather fiery. After his, I think his Opus 1 or 2 concertos was published, he was unsatisfied with the reception that they gained, and as a result destroyed almost all of the remaining copies, and even the plates, the printing plates, which would enable more copies to be made, he destroyed them in a fit of rage. We've kind of all been there, haven't we? In terms of compositional style, Sammartini's writing was very much forward-thinking for his time. He composed in a style which incorporated features, unknowingly of course, of the later classical styles or galant styles, including binary movement form, minuets and rondos to finish sonatas, also galant ornamentation, so smaller ornamentation, in opposition to some of the really florid Italian ornamentation that was in the Corellian style a few decades before, and even some chromaticism. So anyway, enough talking, let's hear some Giuseppe Sammartini. This recording is taken from his sonata that I was mentioning earlier in D minor, number 6 of his 12 sonatas published in 1727. Thank you so much for joining me this week for another foray into an undeservedly forgotten Baroque composer. In a fortnight's time, I'll be presenting a special episode on mental health in early music. This is an exceptionally important topic, and I'll be asking several of my friends and colleagues for their own contributions, as it's something that really does affect us all in the profession. See you then.